I am Ryan O'Dowd, and this is the Black Hand Communique. Today's episode is going to be entitled, Why Marx Still Matters. I should preface this by saying I am not a communist, nor do I endorse the policies of the Communist Party, especially that of the 20th century. But I do still think Marx's analysis matters. And here's why. Even if one is a right-winger, a strict adherent to Mises and the Austrian School of Economics, you would be missing a vital perspective on the economy that represents the viewpoint, or at least attempts to represent the viewpoint, of a part of society that is not represented well in Austrian economics, which is labor. And society in general, because Austrianism essentially decided that all people are fundamentally free-floating atomized individuals that have no allegiances culturally or economically to anyone else independent of their individual consumer decisions. And there's lots of reasons why I go into why that's bullshit, but I'm talking about Marxism today. I'm only using Austrianism as a way to dialectically, show a mirror to it. So the reason that I think that Marxism matters, especially now in the 21st century, is that Marx's analysis or critique of capital is still by and large very appropriate and accurate to the way things are. Why I say I'm not a communist is because I do not agree with what he proposes as the solutions to the problems that he points out in his critique of capital. So, and I think that much of the problems in terms of political oppression and economic destruction and famine that occurred because of communist parties gaining control in the 20th century, in my opinion, is because of them trying to attempt to impose Marxist solutions to capitalist problems. Okay? But that does not say that Marx's critique of capital is inaccurate. It is definitely accurate, especially the labor theory of value. And when I say this, I don't mean that I agree with Marx's and John Locke's and Adam Smith's assumption that labor is the only source of economic value in the entire society, and the only measurement of economics is labor and labor hours. What I mean is, rather, that it is undeniably true, and anyone with common sense can agree, that nobody who works as an employee at a company is getting back what they're putting in. Inherently, they are giving more to their company in economic value than they're getting back. And it's measured, like Marx said, in the form of profit. The profit has to come from somewhere, and if you believe the Austrians that everything is fundamentally subjectively valuable, and essentially there's no ruler to economics, there's no mile marker or metric system to economics, and it's all just a free-floating, free-for-all, and of inherently subjective value, well then you believe the profit comes essentially from distorting the value of labor when you're selling it to the consumer and convincing them that it's worth more in labor and resources than you actually put in which case you believe it's founded on a lie, or you believe profit is founded on the theft of the value from the labor itself, which is what Marx says. So it's a lie or it's theft. You make up your own mind about that. But the point is, no one that works for a company is getting back in money what they're putting in. And it's so obvious that even the most capitalist, capital C Austrians, capitalists, will agree to this on the basis of the way they frame this question, which is, why would anyone hire you if they're not getting more from you than you're giving them, than they're giving back? Like, if you run a company, why would you hire a worker that you couldn't take more from than you gave to? Oh, because how else are you making a profit? Because remember, In capitalist world, profit is the be-all and end-all of economic value. It's the purpose, it's the motivation for economics, it's the motivation for work, and without it, capitalists literally believe the entire economy would fall apart without the promise of being able to get more than you put in, which is what profit is. Marx said that's labor theft. I have a tendency to agree, and I think on that point, even the capitalists agree. They just justify it by saying, why else would we hire you? Okay? So for that reason, as a way of articulating the value of labor in the workplace and how it fits into the profit motive of capitalists, Marx is spot on. Even in the 21st century, anyone can see that. Now, what's interesting to this, about this fact to me, is that the capitalist, and typically American, but I think there's plenty of Americans that do not agree with this, the typical American capitalist response to this is to assume that the point of view of the capitalist is inherently the one that is going to be making the decisions in the economic superstructure, in the structure of a society, and to even moralize that to not allow the capitalists to make the decision about how much they take from you is immoral on some argument of the virtue of property metaphysically extracted from the value of you being alive, which is, in other words, you're alive, therefore what you make becomes yours, therefore you have the unlimited ability to amass as much as you want without any regard for any other human being, without being stopped or mitigated in any way whatsoever as an inherent human right, which is what libertarian Austrians actually argue. They actually argue that you can, because you're alive and you make something, all the trades that come out of that inherently give you an absolute king-like authority over every piece of property you can manage to accumulate, regardless of what you do with it. That's the Austrian point of view, and it reveals itself in the assumption that the capitalist has the power in the first place in this little workplace scenario we're talking about, where you're working for an employer. And your employer, why would the employer hire you if you weren't going to give them more than they gave back to you? That's the inherent a priori assumption of capitalism. And the thing is, just observing reality and being empirical can show you there's at least one other perspective in there, which is, why would I work for you if you're not going to give me at least an equal value to what I'm giving you? And the capitalists don't look at that. They don't look at the working class perspective on the situation, where you're looking for labor, even though they're claiming, the Austrians and the capitalists are claiming from the beginning that you are an equal partner in the economic sphere, that somehow one uneducated individual is equal in a voluntary arrangement and contract with a multinational corporation. And you're equal in power, and you're just deciding, we want to work together, okay? And yet they'll also argue, well, why would that company ever hire you unless they can essentially exploit you, take more from you than you give them? That's just the assumption that they have, without ever just taking that dialectical perspective and just turning it around and saying, why would I work for you if you won't pay me what I am worth? Or if you will not let me have ownership over what I make or the machine I use to make it? They never, ever, ever turn it around, and they pretend that it's an inherent a priori definition of property that just springs out of the desire to remain alive. And the irony of that, and why Marx continues to matter in the 21st century, is that capitalists begin at valuing life, and then they extract property from the value of life and guarantee absolute authority over property on that basis. And then when someone comes along who doesn't have any property and is starving to death and steals something to eat to be alive, they claim it's an act of aggression against the property holder, who is actually controlling the means that other people need to use to make what they live. So the capitalists start from a point of view of I'm alive, therefore what I make is mine, therefore what I trade for what I make is mine, therefore I can have everything to infinity. That's their argument. And they strangle the actual life of anyone else born in this world, which is a physical world. It's not a metaphysical world where we can just expand property out to forever and just suddenly teleport new people out to do property. It's a physical world that's limited. It's the earth. Okay? And they impose their property values on people who have never even been born yet. And then when the people that have never been born have zero bargaining in this marketplace whatsoever because they have no property other than their life, the capitalists argue it's a voluntary choice for this worker to sell themselves into the system. It isn't. Not only is it not voluntary, it's immoral, and it betrays, this analysis betrays an inherent assumption about the nature of economics, which isn't true. And it proves why capitalism is an inherently conservative economic theory. This is not to say that the Communist Party did not create horrific dictatorships due to the way that they tried to implement the proposed solutions of Marx. I agree with you completely on that. They were heinous in what they did. Destroyed millions of lives. But that does not invalidate the fundamental critique of capital that Marx had, which is labor gets exploited for profit, and property is owned by the capitalist and manipulated to enrich themselves at the expense of those who own nothing. Both of those things are true. And the reason that capitalism is inherently conservative is because the one argument you're always going to hear from these capitalists, especially the Austrians, is that you socialists, I am not a communist. I will never be a communist. I have lots of reasons why, and I'll explain it in another video. But you socialists automatically that you won't look at reality. That's always what they say. You won't look at what is. You got to look at the way the world is, not the way the world want to be. And that's a conservative viewpoint inherently, because it assumes that just whatever the current way of doing things is the way it will always be forever, and that we have no existential choice, and we have no ability to change anything or even to reframe the perspective without changing anything, just by showing what the working class perspective is in this system, and that once is, always shall be, as though the economy is God. It was and is to be. Which isn't true, because the economy has had major creatively destructive changes since the beginning of history. So there's bullshit. That's complete bullshit, and it's conservative. So that's why I think that Marx is still valid in the 21st century, is because it still shows the critique of capital and the dialectical point of view of the working class under a system of capitalism, regardless of the fact that the communist parties of the 20th century utterly eviscerated the working class and destroyed people because they were trying to implement the solutions Marx said. Solutions wrong, critique correct. That's why Marx still matters. I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and this is the Black Hand Communique saying, fuck the banks.